Welcome back to Bossing English with Mr. F. Not to be confused with Bossing Lepidoptery with Mr. F, which is all about butterfly collecting and a completely different channel. Haha. Okay, today Act 4 of Hamlet, key ideas. We're going to kind of skip through and look at some key ideas and how they relate to things that appear earlier in the play, especially ideas like motif. It's a nice bit of critical terminology. A motif is an idea that's kind of continually returned to through a work of art. You might know of late motifs. Oops, I need to put my pen on here. For music, is that going to work now? Yeah, late motifs. If you're a fan of Wagner, you will know that he uses leitmotifs, leading motifs all the way through, but we can just use the word motif in a literary work as well. So in Act 4, Shakespeare continues to return to motifs such as illness as a symptom of corruption. We also get Machiavellian scheming linked to Claudius, pulling into that orbit of Machiavellianism, Laertes, and other themes as well, like madness and doubling. Now, one way, a really useful way to find these motifs, or key quotes anyway, is to use a PDF. So if you go to Google Shakespeare, just type in Hamlet PDF, and then you'll find shakespeare.folger.edu. It's probably the first result that comes up. This is a really good one, but other options are available. And then you click on there, and then you get to the PDF. And then it's just a case of doing a keyword search. So I'm just going to have to turn this around, otherwise it won't work. I'm going to try and do this because, as you can see, I've got that at the top. So then I'll type in like the word rank. Careful how you say that. And then just search. And then we can see we're in Act 1, Scene 2, the first soliloquy, things rank and gross in nature. Here, rank means, as an adjective, very unpleasant. As a smell or just as a thing, something very unpleasant. And then we can just skip through and see other uses of that by using the arrows. And not all of them will be relevant, but here, rankly abused. Here, rank is being used to mean utter or total. But if we go further on, you'll see marrying no, so rank has made dishonour him. And then we get, be careful, because sometimes it'll bring up things where rank is in the word, like frankly. But there's the one we looked at in the last video. Here's a good one. Claudius, oh, my offence is rank, it smells to heaven. So there's a nice way of tying Claudius and Hamlet together through the use of that one word, and the crime and what's happening to Denmark as a product of Claudius's corrupt behaviour. And then at the end we have the one about the bed, don't we? Where are we? In the rank sweat of an enseamed bed, and we get use of the word corruption there as well. So there we can see those three uses in Act 1, Scene 2. Claudius kind of becoming aware of his crime, or at least admitting it to himself in the chapel, and then at the end the closet scene where Hamlet refers to the bed, returning again to Act 1, Scene 2, and that idea of incestuous sheets. But that word rank ties all that together, that adjective rank, so that's quite interesting as a motif there. Anyway, that's one way to do that. I'm going to turn back round, get rid of that, go back to that, and then we will plough on. Another way of looking at that is then, once you've got that idea of illness and corruption, is maybe to look at its opposite. And another word I think is really interesting here is conscience. And conscience is a debated term in its Elizabethan context, where some people think it meant consciousness, and you might often see it translated that way in your version of Hamlet. But scholars do debate about whether it has the more modern meaning of like an inner moral law, that kind of moral demon or inner god telling you the difference between right and wrong. And what I'll do is I'll link to a couple of articles, one a blog on the OUP, and one which is just a chapter summary of a Cambridge publication by Catherine Belsey, Shakespeare in Theory and Practice, which just summarises, in both recent articles, 2012, 2016, kind of showing you the modern debate, and the jury seems to be leaning in the favour of actually it does have that more modern meaning of telling right from wrong, and certainly in Hamlet it seems to have that meaning, so that's worth thinking about. there as well. Okay, let's crack on with our summary of Act 4, and I'm just going to pull out certain interesting things here. Let's have a look at the theme of madness, which is introduced when Gertrude explains the death of Polonius. Now, it's interesting that she leads with "mad as the sea and wind," similes there, when both contend which is the mightier, in his lawless fit. So the madness, the fit, explaining the behaviour, and the order is important there, because she starts with that and reveals the death, the murder, unseen, the unseen good old man. Again, is this a way to justify the errant behaviour, to excuse it? Is this a loving gesture on behalf of Gertrude following the closet scene? Is she changed because Hamlet has exposed her own soul and sinning to herself? Something to ponder. "Oh, heavy deed, it had been so with us had we been there." Interesting that the first thing that Claudius thinks of is himself. "His liberty is full of threats to all, to you yourself, to us, to everyone." But interestingly, it had been so with us, i.e. me, the royal we there, had we been there. So again, we see characterization of Claudius as egotistical, narcissistic psychology. What's really interesting in Act 4 is the use of the motif of Machiavellian scheming that we get from Claudius, and that's what I've marked in purple. Now, Claudius is always Machiavellian as he appears to us from his very first speech in Act 1, Scene 2. He has to perform, it's like performative role-playing, acting. We also maybe get onto the theme and motif of acting with, he has to claim, he's claimed the throne wrongly, so he has to appear to be a true king, a valid king, the rightful king. So he adopts the language of the king, the royal we, our dear brother's death. We, the use of the royal we, and using diplomacy to kind of express grief in a public setting, despite obviously doing so with a forked tongue, because the king's only dead because of him. So he's very clever at doing this, and he continues to do this throughout this act. So here, "But so much was our love, we would not understand what was most fit." So when Gertrude is talking about her son being mad, Claudius is explaining why up until now he's kept him close as opposed to sending him away. And then he reverts to, this is just bullshit, isn't it? "But so much was our love, we would not understand what was most fit." He was keeping a potential enemy close at hand so he could keep an eye on him should he decide to make a move on him on the throne. And then we get some of the corruption/illness motif. "But like the owner of a foul disease, to keep it from divulging, let it feed even on the pith of life." This is ironic as well, isn't it? Because he could be speaking about himself here with what he's done, and we know that he has those thoughts from the chapel scene where he confesses that. Again, further on, we see this kind of feigned kingship and Machiavellianism. "This vile deed we must, with all our majesty and skill, both countenance and excuse." So this is how to deal with the death of Polonius, knowing that Laertes will probably come seeking revenge for that. Interesting, always this metaphor of deed in Shakespeare for murder sometimes. "With all our majesty and skill, both countenance and excuse." So he's already thinking ahead, plotting, conniving, how to manage this. It's in spin. In a modern setting, we would call this spin, wouldn't we? How to control the story, manage it, limit, damage limitation from the fallout from that. Okay, let's move on. Again, one interesting bit of characterization is we learn Claudius's contempt for the hoi polloi, the public. "He's loved of the distracted multitude, who like not in their judgment but their eyes." It's quite interesting, isn't it, the way that's so dismissive of why the public would like Hamlet, because he's handsome, his physical appearance, the distracted multitudes. This is kind of suggests a contempt there for the way the public behave. Moving on, we get a return again to the disease motif. Disease is desperate grown by desperate appliance, or relieved or not at all. So there's a bit of alliteration there that you could explore. I'll just see what I put beneath this thing here. Where are we? It's ironic because he's the rot. Disease is desperate grown by desperate appliance, or relieved or not at all. Well, in the case of Elsinore, the court of Denmark, the state of Denmark, the rot, the unweeded garden, the prison of Elsinore is because the disease of Claudius has not been excised, removed by Hamlet. Revenge has not been enacted, and so it continues. And again, there's that kind of irony, maybe the unwitting truth he's saying and the lack of maybe self-knowledge that Claudius has at times. Or it could be, sometimes I think Claudius is kind of seeing what he can get away with, like enjoying the fact that he has this secret knowledge, and in public he sometimes allows himself to say things like flirts with the danger of being caught, like as someone who thinks he's cleverer than the public and those around him. He tries to see how far he can push things and get away with it. Okay, now Hamlet is still playing that antic disposition of being mad, but at this moment, and keeping in line with the idea of corruption and illness, we get this incredible idea about corrupted dead bodies. A man may fish with the worm that hath eat of the king, and eat of the fish that have fed of that worm. What dost thou mean by this? Asked Claudius. Nothing but to show you how a king may go progress through the guts of a beggar. So there's all kinds of things happening there to do with what happens to bodies. It seems to preempt Act 5, Scene 1 and the gravedigger scene, where death and life and the great are reduced to skulls, and the meaning of life and a kind of nihilism may be attached to that, which we've already glimpsed earlier in some of the meditations on life and death from Hamlet. But here, what's really impressive is he's saying this to the king, and there's a logic there. So this isn't just madness. There's kind of a really thoughtful metaphysical idea being revealed here in a kind of coded language. But there is wisdom here, there is intelligence here, and I think this makes Hamlet at times seem like a wise fool. Often in Shakespearean plays like King Lear, we have a fool who seems to say mad, crazy things, but actually there's wisdom in that, because that's the only way you can speak truth to power, is through this kind of madness, or kind of foolish, jesting language. And I think Hamlet does that at times. So we could think of him at times as a wise fool, and this antic disposition allows him to say things, to critique power, to speak truth to power to the king in public, as he does elsewhere earlier in the play. And he certainly does so here. Now, in researching this, I found an article from an American magazine called The Atlantic, which seems to date from 1899. I'll link to it in the description, which also explores this, and it has this to say. No, Hamlet was a fool in the same sense of the word that Lear's friend and advisor of the motley, that's the kind of multicoloured dress that jesters wore, was a fool. He recognised that the world was all awry, that wickedness, drunkenness, lewdness and injustice were enthroned, and that he could do nothing to remedy it, nor to relieve the bitterness within him, but by sarcastic speeches and euphemisms veiled in clownishness. There's ne'er a villain dwelling in all Denmark, but he's an arrant knave. Taken with its context, is the quintessence of Shakespearean fooling. So I think that's quite an interesting way to explore how much language uses at times, and in particular here, when he's appearing to say mad things, but actually there's wisdom behind those words. Okay, let's crack on. So following that, we get some classic plotting, Machiavellian plotting, where Claudius alone on stage reveals the plot by letters congruing to that effect the present death of Hamlet, so informing the audience of this plot. Do it, England, for like the hectic, in my blood he rages, and now must cure me. So I think hectic is fever, and again, that illness motif is returned to, and the idea of the cure for the illness being in death of Hamlet, as far as Claudius is concerned, because of the safety that will bring to him. Okay, moving on. We have Act 4, Scene 4, and Hamlet's seventh and final soliloquy, which is a really interesting one, because again, he is prompted by seeing Fortinbras about to wage war on Poland for something worthless, a tiny plot of land, and it prompts him to think about his own inability to enact revenge despite having so many reasons to do so. At times this is very interesting because it returns us to the monologue of Act 2, Scene 2, when he thinks about what a piece of work is a man, and the paragon of animals, godlike reason. So he seems to be saying here that if a man only eats and drinks and all this talk, he's no more than a beast unless he's able to use that godlike reason to achieve something. And then he reflects on his own inability to do that, and this might make us think of something he said, which is a really important little bit about the nature of certain men and why they go wrong, what corrupts them. A vicious mole of nature that kind of stamps its defect upon the body. And that's from Act 1, Scene 4. And here he seems to be talking about his own vicious mole of nature that has stamped that defect upon him. Some craven scruple of thinking too precisely on the event. Today we might use the phrase overthinking, but it could also be like rationality, this kind of curse of consciousness, of self-reflection. A thought which quartered hath but one part wisdom, and ever 3 parts coward. And that reminds us of to be or not to be, conscious makes cowards of us all. And here conscious might be more consciousness, the ability to reflect and think about things, but it could also be that idea of always trying to judge the right and wrong thing, that inner moral law, talking about it. So some craven scruple, again, that seems to link to the idea of conscience as a moral arbiter. And we might use, in the 19th century, we might have used the word sensibility, late 18th century, or in the post-Enlightenment, we might talk about bien pensant, rationality, or things like this, but obviously we're pre that. So we might just think of a Renaissance man, but he seems so modern to us, and that's what's so interesting about Hamlet. He really seems to be himself out of time. The time's out of joint, but it's more like Hamlet's out of joint with the time. Okay, so he reminds us of what those reasons are. I do not know, yet I live to say there's things to do, since I have cause and will and strength and means to do it. So he gives all the reasons why he should be able to kill the. So then he kind of reminds us of of the means he has to be able to enact revenge on behalf of his father. I do not know why, yet I live to say there's things to do, sith I have cause and will and strength and means to do it. And then we get this wonderful image of, and this is where that doubling theme comes in, of Fortinbras. So this is Hamlet's mirror image, or double, in the same way that Laertes, another revenge hero in the play, will become a mirror image or double. They're all enacting revenge on behalf of dead fathers. So Hamlet sees this man led by a delicate and tender prince, so of a similar age to Hamlet, but actually doing something as opposed to just talking about it or thinking about it. Of course, what we need to remember is that Shakespeare doesn't want Hamlet to be just your common or garden revenge hero, where would be the fun in writing another revenge tragedy with someone similar to all the other revenge heroes that have come previously in things like Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy, or the many others that this is kind of in conversation with. He has to be different because Shakespeare wants him to be different. And we might use the word meta in a modern setting to think that Hamlet has this self-awareness and seems to be almost like a theatrical self-awareness of how different he is from other revenge heroes around him. So he calls, this is a lovely phrase, when he calls the plot of land that they're fighting over an eggshell, so that, you know, a sense of worthlessness. And he uses another kind of derogatory term that, but greatly to find, you know, it is not to stir without great argument. Rightly to be great is not to stir without great argument, but greatly to find quarrel in a straw when honour's at the stake. So, I mean, Hamlet has all the reasons, all the arguments. He has great arguments, but it shouldn't require that. If your honour's at stake, as his is, he should be able to fight over a blade of straw, like Fortinbras is doing at present. And then again, just to make him, it's almost like he's trying to inspire himself with the rage required to commit revenge. A father killed, a mother stained, excitements of my reason and my blood, while to my shame I see the imminent death of 20,000 men. So there's a wonderful kind of hyperbole of contrast between an enormous number of men willing to sacrifice himself for nothing, and this one man unable to do that despite the much greater reasons he has to commit revenge. And then he concludes by having kind of stirred himself into a fury of revenge. Oh, from this time forth my thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth. At least he's trying to do that. He's trying to gee himself up to act. So we have listing here earlier with the and, the use of the conjunction there, and at the end an apostrophe, oh, from this time forth, ending on a rhyming couplet, and a sense of seeking to be what he's supposed to be. A resolve to act. And maybe here we could see him trying to emulate the father, who was a warrior king who followed the chivalric code, hence old Fortinbras died in a duel. And maybe this is why by the end of the play, young Fortinbras is able to say he would have proved most noble had he been put on, had he become king, because he's starting to think and act like a rightful prince, like a true revenge hero in a way, maybe. All right, let's skittle on. Act 4, Scene 5, we see the aftermath of Hamlet's words, their impact on the mother. To my sick soul, as sin's true nature is, and then the idea of guilt spilling itself, again, wonderful, playful rhyming couplets being used here. This is an aside, so it's to us directly, so we're getting an insight into her inner thoughts, and the idea of illness there. My sick soul and how the truth will out. Claudius starts to fear for his life, listing all the reasons why he's likely to be at risk from Polonius's death, and then mentions the brother Laertes coming back, feeds on his wonder, keeps himself in clouds. That cloud imagery there, interesting, because it reminds us of the clouds hanging around Hamlet when he speaks to him in Act 1, Scene 2. I just spotted that. Oops. There we are. Let's see if I can do that. Yeah, so that's like and maybe people who are morbid or grieving, especially if there's a question mark over the death, there's always a threat implied to that in that imagery and that word there. Maybe that clouds his sight in terms of how safe he is. And wants not buzzards to infect his ear with pestilent speeches of his father's death. So there, the verb to infect, pestilent as an adjective, really interesting use of that disease or corruption motif in relation to the threat now posed to him. Oh, my dear Gertrude, dislike to a murdering piece in many places gives me superfluous death. He's liable to be accused of the crime from various sources, and so he has many ways that he could die. What's really interesting is the way that Claudius handles Laertes, who comes in with a mob, raging, seeking blood. So here I think we see the political skill of Polonius. And again, I always think of his first speech in Act 1, Scene 2 as a masterclass of diplomacy, Machiavellian speech, maybe bravado, braggadocio, kind of boastful overreach in terms of what can I get away with. I'm so clever, I'm so Machiavellian, I can say what I can push things to their limits here. So here he uses some kind of trigger words, keywords, which are for Laertes' to kind of calm him down. Let him go, Gertrude. Do not fear our person. Use of the royal we. There's such divinity doth hedge a king, a reminder of the divine right of kings, that treason can but peep to what it would, acts little of his will. So the use of the royal we, the reminder of the divine right of kings, and the use of the word treason are all designed to put Laertes on the back foot and remind him of what he risks at this moment. Some stigmatia here. Where is my father dead, but not by him? Let him demand his fill. How came he dead? I'll not be juggled with. To hell allegiance, vows to the blackest devil, conscience and grace to the profoundest pit. I'll be revenged most thoroughly for my father. Here we're mirroring and doubling, because Laertes is acting like a classic revenge hero, completely at odds with Hamlet and what he did. So we have this classical revenge hero versus the modern Shakespearean revenge hero of Hamlet. The problem with Laertes' revenge is that ultimately it becomes a Machiavellian revenge in cahoots with Claudius and tainted by trickery, underhandness. So it goes wrong, hence the tragedy, but also Laertes himself disavows the revenge and seeks forgiveness in his final gasps of breath. All right, Act 4, Scene 7. Some interesting stuff here. This scene starts in media res, so the conversation has been started off stage and continues. So we miss the part of the dialogue, and we catch it. Again, use of the word conscience. We just had that by Laertes and again by Claudius. I always think that's quite interesting. Claudius has a conscience. It was smarting, remember, from Hamlet's words. And Laertes asks, well, you're the king, why haven't you done anything about it? And Claudius seeks to justify that, but doesn't mention madness, interestingly, but mentions two other reasons why he hasn't. And then they start to plot, but let him come. So this is where the blame is shifting to Hamlet. It warms the very sickness in my heart. That's a nice short quote where, again, the theme of sickness, the motif, which was introduced into the play right at the very start with Francisco, I am sick at heart. And here we have another character with this kind of illness, and maybe revenge is the illness here that's corrupting him, and the desire for revenge in that Old Testament way of a life for a life. Claudius plotting again, I will work him. So Claudius planned to manipulate and exploit. He shall not choose but fall, but even his mother shall uncharge the practice and call it accident. So again, he's already done this once with old Hamlet, and he plans to do the same with young Hamlet through the same means of poison. So there's more doubling there. All right, we're almost getting there, aren't we? What's left? Claudius uses flattery, praising Laertes for his ability to use a sword. There's further manipulation. Laertes, what was your father? Was your father dear to you, or are you like the painting of a sorrow, a face without a heart? So this metaphorical language saying, is it all surface and no feeling? Is it all for show? Is it like the mask and acting? And then Claudius, what would you undertake to show yourself indeed your father's son, more than in words? So again, an interesting doubling and mirroring with Hamlet, who's all words and no action, and knows it and hates himself for it. Whereas Claudius manipulating, pushing the button of grief and filial duty to the father with those words, and contrasting deed with word there, and Laertes' instant response to cut his throat in the church. And what's really interesting is this is a kind of inversion of Hamlet. What Hamlet could not do for his father, which is kill Claudius while he was praying in the chapel, Laertes would be prepared to do, even if it meant clearly damning his own soul. And Claudius, again, if we want to see the man, revenge should have no bounds. So again, interesting that he's able to do that. So the Machiavellian plot of the double poisoning, interesting the use of the poison in the cup as well as on the sword to make doubly sure that it works. It's very Machiavellian and classic revenge tragedy. Whew! We made it to the end. You know what to do. Likey like, subby sub, and I will be back with something on Act 5, probably following on with the idea of revenge. I've just read a brilliant article about revenge on the British Library website, so I'll zoom in on that as a kind of way to explore what happens at the end and the different types of revenge. Who gets satisfactory revenge? Does anyone? And the ending, that body count, what does it mean? So we'll look at the last scenes and what that means. Right, there we are. Good luck for anyone doing mocks this week. Keep it real, spread the love, and I'll be back soon with more felicity. And on. Bye for now.